Good afternoon. My name is Robert LaVirtue, and I will be presenting to you Chapter 6, Social Perception, Attributes, and Perceived Fairness. We're going to start off this chapter with discussing a little bit of social perception and how that can play many different roles in your life. Social perception, best described as a process in which we use our prior experiences and impressions, prior experiences and outcomes with people to form our impressions of them. Your social perception of a person may be completely different than someone else's perception of that person. And the reason I say this is because just because you've had an experience where you might perceive somebody as being something they may or may not be, doesn't mean the next person is going to look at them as that way. Schema is the next thing that I want to discuss, because the schema is basically our organized pattern of how we perceive people. This can be based off of previous experiences or things that we may have heard. The issue with schema is that whenever we're grouping all these things into certain categories and whatnot, you tend to look at preconceived notions and also stereotypes a little too much, and it's kind of hard to differentiate those two. Perception definitely can be our biggest downfall whenever it comes to interacting with people, because you may think that you might have how they're acting down pat, but really you may not. One of the first issues that I want to get into is categorization. And the reason why I'm sorry, I had a hard time with that one. The reason why we use this word is because this is how we often put people into categories. You may look at some people as criminals, good people, bad people. There's multiple things that you can break people down to. And if you are following along with the slide, now would be a good time to switch it over to slide 3. And that's going to still be social perception. But this is the next issue that we roll into, and that's selective perception. Now, selective perception comes from a number of things, and that can be what you want to perceive people and how you want to see them. This can be an error because it can be very blinding to people just based off of views, you know what I mean? This does also work negatively and positively. One of the positive things that it can do is give people the halo effect. And the halo effect is whenever you look at one good thing about somebody and just perceive that their entire person is a good person, Sometimes people can put on a front and have you fooled, so this is another issue that can be a problem and give you an error. The contrast effect is one of the next ones that I would like to discuss, and with the contrast effect, we use the contrast effect for a number of things, and this goes for people as well. In this aspect, we can basically describe it as you meet somebody who is very wealthy, very successful in their life and whatnot, and you enjoy the presence of that person. Well, you meet another person who may have a similar characteristic or something, and you might take that person and compare them to. We can't really do that because you may not know all the sides of one person or the other. It's kind of comparing apples to oranges. This leads to the next topic, and that is projection. People use projection for a multitude of reasons. A lot of people, you see it in younger managers where they will decide that, hey, this kid looks a lot like me. He's ambitious, he's working through school, he's going to college. They share the same aspirations. And this is where projection really can take off in a positive or a negative way. It can help somebody who's really trying their best to succeed in life, and it could also really hurt somebody because if they're not really trying to go the same way that you perceive or you're trying to project them to go, it could lead to a number of issues down the road. Like I said, projection mainly being issues whenever people think like, hey, this kid's a lot like me, so I'm going to push him to go into the same routes and things that I did. Give me 1 second to catch up here. We are still on slide 3, getting ready to go ahead and move on to how we do classify people. And we'll go ahead and move on to that. And the classification of people is one of our biggest issues that we have as humans. And, you know, people always have their own ways of classifying each other, but they generally fall into these 3 ways. The first thing is falling into the goals of the perceiver. And the goals of the perceiver, this can be a number of things, and the best way to describe that is, how are you looking at this person and how do they fit into your grand scheme of plans? This can be, how do they help you achieve your goal? Are they standing in the way of you achieving your goal? So this is not looking at much of factors that they are as a person, but more so what they can do for you. The next thing that I want to talk about is the social context. And people tend to use the social context to classify people as introvert, extrovert, many different things, you know. Whenever you're using your social context of people, you look at them and, you know, you have an idea of how somebody should act in public. That's not saying that that's how people always act in public. And the next one we want to talk about is the accessibility in their memory. And this comes from people not really understanding how exactly other people act. So they go back to their memory and what they know before and after. This can be brought up, best described as a situation that may have already occurred to you. And whenever you have a situation that's already occurred to you, you tend to bring those memories of how it made you feel, how the outcomes were, and whatnot. And this is basically how we classify people. So if you see somebody who reminds you of somebody, you know, off of visual appearance, maybe their voice, maybe their tone, many different things, and you use your memory to basically form an opinion on that person just based off of a few things. And that's where we get these preconceived notions that people judge others too quickly based off of things that, you know, don't really matter. We can go ahead now to slide number 5, and that one's titled Attributions. And basically an attribution is the excuse that people use for their actions or what they say is the cause of their actions. The 3 easy ways to decide whether an attribution is caused from an internal conflict or an external conflict. Internal being, you know, things that are going on in your personal life. External being things such as like luck. You know, you got bad luck. Just things that you can't really control. You know, location, whatnot. The first thing that you can really tell is off of consistency, and if people are consistent, that usually is a good thing. Whenever you start to see that spotty, inconsistent actions, that can be bad, and that can hint some forthcomings of bad times. The next thing you want to pay attention to is their distinctiveness and how distinctive somebody is. If you have a straight A student and they get straight A's the next semester on report cards, it's not that big of a deal. Now, if you have somebody who is getting D's and F's and then they turn around and have straight A's, that's a lot of distinctiveness because they're a lot of difference from what they used to act. And the same goes for the straight A kid. If he were to get F's, it'd be way different and people would notice. But whenever they kind of stay on the same, they don't notice. And the last one that we want to talk about with the attributions is the consensus. And this is pretty much how you pretty much relate how others would act. Yeah. Basically what it is how other people would act in the situation that you're in. And, you know, you can take a look at how others would act in that situation and, you know, kind of get a good idea of how someone should act. One of the errors that you can come across is people have the self-serving attribute, and that's basically whenever they do good, they want to take the credit, but if it's bad, somebody else is at fault. Another one is the fundamental attribution error, and this is described as our tendency to underestimate the impact both of internal and external factors, and also defensive attributions is whenever there's an excuse or reason for the situation, you know. Go ahead and flip to the 7th slide, and this is the final one. And this is off of perceived fairness and how exactly you feel that situations have been fair. Some people may feel that some situations turn out against them or not in their favor. Others may feel like it turned out better in their favor. This is where organizational fairness comes in, and it's basically how the employees feel off of events, policies, and if they judge them to be fair or not. Many outcomes, how we perceive, they may not be the best outcomes, you know what I mean? We often think of fairness playing out in 3 separate ways, as distributive fairness, and that's, did we get what we wanted? And sometimes yes. The next one is procedural fairness, and that is best described as were the procedures followed to ensure that all fairness was completed. And you do have some sticklers who really pay attention to that one. And the last one is the interaction fairness, and that is basically were you given correct information, were you given all the details, and were you given enough time to get a solid thought in the decision-making process. But like I said, that pretty much wraps up Chapter 6, Social Perception, Attributions, and Perceived Fairness. One thing that I do want to leave people with is whenever you start and look at how people act in the workplace, you see some people act atrocious, can be terrible employees, but yet they get the highest honor, they get treated fairly well, they get better jobs. Your perceived fairness of somebody doing 1/3 of the work and getting 3 times the praise, how would you feel about that? Thank you. Robert the Virtue. Have a good night.